Your experience may not be the same as mine. It may well be. I can remember not long after I was converted from an entirely non-Christian background, reading this passage and being shocked, being taken aback that suddenly you're confronted with a God who says to his friend Abraham, take your son and offer him. And you can understand, can't you, someone who's not a Christian or even a very new Christian coming across this particular incident and looking at it and thinking, what on earth is going on here? Well, let me try and open that up this evening in this way. I want to ask you to answer for yourself a very fundamental question, whether you're a Christian or not. Well, a couple of very fundamental questions that dig to the very heart of our humanity. Here they come. What is it? What is it? Where is it? Where is it? Now, I deliberately asked them initially, starting that sort of way around. What is it? Where is it? What I'm asking you is to ask yourself as we enter into this passage, what is your most precious possession as a human being? Where is your most precious possession? Is it actually that it's in your possessions? Or maybe it's in your dreams, what you dream of in terms of what you'd like to be or what you'd like to do or what you'd like to your family to know. Is it your career? Is it a relationship? Whatever it is, every human being, by our very nature of being created in God's image and living in a fallen world, has a precious possession that we value more than the God who has made us. Even as Christians, part of our struggle in living out the Christian life is learning to actually understand that these things, as good as they are and as right as they are and as how they fill our lives with good things, there are priorities. And the only way to begin to get hold of this passage is to understand here is a man of God living by faith who is now being asked to consider what is his most precious possession. At this juncture, it is this young lad, probably at this time of life, something like 10, 12, maybe 13, 14 years of age. The child that he and his wife had waited for so long. And suddenly this God who has promised this child and given this child suddenly says, Abraham, take this child of yours and offer him up. Now, if we're going to understand what's going on, let's kind of break it down in three ways, okay? Let's think first and foremost here about, because it's very important to understand this, the timing of this particular event, of this testing of Abraham's faith. It's a very in-your-face event, isn't it? That's why I began that way. It's controversial in some ways. It's stark. It's not only because, of course, in terms of the culture in which Abraham lived, it would not have been unusual for him to have done something so atrociously unhuman as to offer a child in sacrifice. It's one of the great ongoing discussions with God has with his people in the Old Testament. Don't be like the nations round about you. Don't put your children through the fires. But yeah, now here is a man of God who's been told by the one true God to seemingly do exactly that. It's a very unique event. But it's very important we understand the timing of what actually is going on here, because we're told quite simply, aren't we? Sometime later, God tested Abraham. The word test, in some translations, older translations, unhelpfully, is used, the word tempt is used. That's not a good translation, simply because the whole emphasis of the word is simply that. It is to actually put someone to the test, to try something by touch and smell, to physically have something and decide, well, just what can I make of this? How do I know that this is a solid and a good thing? Is to test it. A bit like, an engineer. I don't know about you, but I was always fascinated as a kid by those pictures and cine camera of the building of the Wembley Stadium in the 1920s. And in order, before they could open, they tested it. They got thousands of unemployed men basically to march around the stadium to test how solid the whole kind of framework of the stadium was. It's that idea that's happening here. That what is being tested is Abraham's faith, his trust, his obedience to the God who has called him. And this testing is not a temptation. It's not that kind of negative connotation that we read of in the life of our Lord Jesus, for instance, when at the beginning of his ministry we're told that he is tempted. There's something here that's not negative but very positive. Testing, evaluating. And please notice what's important here is the timing of this testing. Look at your scriptures. Look at how it begins in chapter, say it's almost very ordinary way, beginning of the chapter. Sometime later. And if you just look back a bit into the last verse of the previous chapter, it says, Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a very long time. One of the things the writer is trying to show as we go into this incident is that this testing, the timing of this testing, was not arbitrary. God is not being capricious. He's not suddenly, can I put it this way, he's not suddenly waking up one day and think, I know what I'll do today, I'll go and test Abraham. The writer's being very deliberate. And don't forget that includes this. Here is a man who just a few years previously, because of the complications in his own family life, has had to send away his eldest son, Ishmael. And now here's the son God has promised. And God is asking him to do something that must have been incredibly difficult to face up to. What are we being taught here? What we're being taught is this, that the tests of faith that Christians may have to go through not only are in the hands of a loving, wise, all-knowing God, but the timing of those testings are in the same hands of a wise, all-loving and knowing God. You see, the Bible does not allow you and I, as we live out our life of faith, to be surprised that sometimes our faith is examined by life circumstances, by our own personal dilemmas or our family relationships, anything that comes into our life that puts our faith, as it were, to the test. We shouldn't be surprised at that. Look at a number of places, but let's taste the most obvious. Jesus' teaching in John chapter 15. Very clear. I am the vine. My Father is the vine dresser. You are the branches. What does my Father do in order to bring forth fruit from the branches that dwell in the vine? He does the one thing my dad would tell me I can't do, I'm hopeless at. I overkill it, apparently, when I prune. He prunes in order to bring forth more fruit. God initiated this test in the life of Abraham at the right time in terms of where Abraham's maturity of faith was. That's very important to understand that the starkness that we think about this incident as we look into it from our point of view, in terms of where Abraham was, it aligned with the depth of the faith that he actually possessed. Someone's put it like this: it's no exaggeration to say Abraham's faith was tried more severely, more repeatedly, and more variously than any other human being. For example, the ties of nature were tested by him when he had to leave his home. The stress of circumstances his faith was tested by. The famine in Egypt. The faith of his brother, Lot, was put to the test when Lot made the poor decisions that he had to make. The test of courage of his faith when he rescued Lot. The test even within of his faith in his own domestic circumstances with Sarah and Hagar. You see, the point I'm really deliberately trying to make here is that this incident, as stark as it appears to you and I, in the way God was dealing with him, God actually knew exactly what he was doing in the right time and right place. And that fits in, doesn't it, with one of the great promises that you possess and I possess as Christians. Paul puts it like this, doesn't he, in 1 Corinthians 10? God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tested or tempted beyond your ability to cope with, and also will provide a way of escape. Why is that encouraging? It's encouraging surely because when we think about some Christians who go through incredible times of testing in their faith. And I don't know about you, and you think, how can they cope with that? We have to understand that their loving Heavenly Father knows exactly what he is doing and knows the strength of their faith, the dynamics of their faith. And as it's true for them, so it's true for you and I too. There's an encouragement there. But let's kind of dive further into that's just first couple of verses. Let's dive further into this and look at the tension in the testing that Abraham went to. That's really verses 3 down to 10. Sometimes in the Bible's narrative, it takes us right in close, doesn't it? Just imagine, so God's given this command. Verse 3, early next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac when he had cut the wood and so on. God tests Abraham. See the maturity of his faith straight away? Immediately, he obeys. I don't know about you, but when I find my faith tested, the first thing I find myself doing is kind of kicking against it, as it were, or sulking about it. Straight away, notice he's ready to go. Don't you think at this particular moment, Abraham would have had some big questions he was wrestling with? Surely he's a human being, isn't he? God, what about the promise you gave me, this incredible promise that through my son will be this wonderful blessing not only of this great nation, but a blessing on all the nations. Or Lord God, what about the hope you gave me when Isaac was born? What are you asking to do about this hope that I've got to see this promise fulfilled? As comment on this, as John Calvin writes, you can imagine Abraham thinking, the whole salvation of the world is about to be extinguished as I give up this son of promise. And then what about this? Would he not be thinking, well, what about all the pagan nations round about? They know that I worship the one true living God. They know that my life is different. I've got different standards, different motivations, and now I'm doing exactly the same. But here's the biggest question now, isn't it? Do you think Abraham was saying, God, are you really asking me to do this? Are you really asking me to lay my son on the altar of sacrifice? And I think if you look at the text carefully, you realise the wonderful nature of Abraham's faith. Look at verse 5. Look at verse 5, where he leaves the servants and the donkey, and they go ahead, Abraham and Isaac. Stay here with the donkey while I go with the boy over there. Listen now. We will worship, and then we will come back. You see what we were saying about the maturity of Abraham's faith here? Here's a man who, in spite of all that seemingly to the contrary, or again, to re-emphasise this, look at verse 8. When Abraham's asked this question by his son, very poignantly, God himself will provide. And there's an incredible mystery here, isn't there? But clearly it seems to be saying, the narrative, Abraham expected God to provide and not to do what he was asked to do. And if we want that reiterated, let's turn over to the New Testament and to the letter to the Hebrews. Letter to Hebrews and chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 17. Look how the inspired writer, interprets these events. Hebrews 11 and verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Now it comes. Abraham reasoned. It's interesting that the actual original comes from the same group of words from which we get the very important New Testament word imputation. To account, to logically think this through. He reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. But the writer is not going to let you and I off the hook. We can look back. He's not hook, should I say. Here's Abraham. He takes his son. He takes this journey. 3 days. Can you imagine that? 3 days walking, pondering all this over, trusting in God to reveal the things that he's not yet revealed. 3 days, and they're stopping at night. There's a campfire. They're eating. All the things that go on, and all the while he's got this incredible turmoil going on in his mind. And then comes a point where they reach the mountain. You stay here, you two guys, with the donkey. My son and I will go further up. And the two of them go on. Yeah, I've got to say, isn't it? There's nothing more precious, is there, than spending time as a parent with your child? You know? And here he is walking up the mountain and again. And then comes the most poignant place of all, isn't it? They're going up the mountain and Isaac says, Dad, yes, son. There's fire and there's wood. But where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Now, I don't want to be dramatic. Isn't that a dagger in the heart of this man's faith? What do I say? Here's the maturity of this man of God's, by the grace of God, faith. Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. You see how that's a statement of faith? At that particular juncture, he did not know for certain that would be the case. But he believed that his God, who had asked him to lead, asked him and led him this way, would provide. And then they get to the place, the mountaintop. And verse 9, it says to you, when he reached a place that God had told him, he built an altar. He bound his son. Not a word from Isaac. Not a word. That says something about the incredible nature of the relationship between father and son, doesn't it? He binds his son and then he lays him on the altar. Isaac knows what this is all about. You can almost imagine Abraham at that point, I don't know, perhaps I'm overemphasising in my imagination. Was there tears rolling down his face? And then comes the final moment. He pulls out the knife, we're told, aren't we? He took the knife to slay his son. The moment of truth had actually arrived. That brings you to the third thing. Let's call it the triumph of God's testing of Abraham. It's only a Christian in one sense who knows something of what happens in the narrative now in their experience. You know, the cynic looks at this and thinks, oh, do you know what? The bloke who wrote this story, he was a bit of a clever writer. He brings you right to the point, right to the, like a good, exciting novel, right to the point, and then it all changes. Well, yeah, okay, but the Christian knows there's something more going on here than that. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven. And notice, why does he repeat his name? Is there a sense of urgency? Abraham, Abraham. Why is this a triumph? Well, let's open the narrative up and try and learn some things. Notice, first of all, this. There's a triumph here of God's intervention. And it is a mark of Abraham's trust and faith that the one who intervenes is whom? We're told there that the angel of the Lord. Now, this is the first time that this mysterious Old Testament person appears to Abraham. Interestingly, he's only appeared previously once, and that's in Genesis 16, when he delivered Hagar when she was running away. And do you notice again, as so often in these incidents where this angel of the Lord, this person appears, look at his language in verse 16. And he said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord. You see what the writer's doing? He's saying it's the angel of the Lord who appears to Abraham, and then he says, here's the Lord. He's doing what all the Old Testament writers do with this particular person, this angel of the Lord, pointing out that there was something more than an angelic intervention occurring here. That there was something of the divine recognized in this person known as the angel of the Lord. And we are right to understand as believers that it is another pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus himself to his servant Abraham. In other words, the significance of this incredible intervention and the nature of what's going on is that Jesus himself, the Lord of the church, Abraham's Lord, actually chooses to intervene. Notice then, secondly, Abraham learns a triumph in this testing of God's provision. He's in faith said to Isaac, "The Lord will provide." And the angel of the Lord calls out, and we're told he looked up. And you can imagine that, can't you? He's absolutely, what can you say? He's totally taken up with what's going on. His son's lying before him. He's not going to be looking anywhere else. And the angel of the Lord cries out to him, and he looks up, and there, caught in a thicket, is a ram. One of those funny things this week, I must admit, I give my secrets away now, don't I? I don't do this very often. Honestly, I don't. Honestly, I was on Facebook, and I was looking at those silly videos that come up, and I like watching some of those animal videos that come up, different things. And there was this guy up in the States somewhere, and there was this huge deer, big antlers, and somehow it got caught up in this huge big netting. And the video just showed you how this guy actually managed to get near this deer. He actually put it out, just put it to sleep, as it were, and took off all this netting, and the creature woke up and off it went. Here's this ram caught in a thicket. The Lord will provide. Look how it's beautifully put. And so Abraham called that place, this is very important, we're going to open this up, the Lord will provide. And to this day is said, on the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Those of you who love the stories of the history of Christian mission know that the great Hudson Taylor, who founded the China Inland Mission, this particular verse was one that he so often returned to and brought his thinking to and his trust in. The Lord will provide. What's Abraham doing? He's learning, isn't he, about God's provision. He's learning that God would fulfill his promise to provide a sacrifice. That Abraham would not have to sacrifice anything to his great God, but his great God would sacrifice everything for him because of his love for him. He was learning the sufficiency of God, wasn't he? In faith's trial, there always comes those wonderful moments. Sometimes it's through another person. Sometimes it's through the change of circumstances. Sometimes it comes with that inner kind of experience that we know, don't we? When almost it's this work of the Spirit of God. He speaks to us, and we suddenly realise, actually, do you know what? God's going to provide. He's going to lead me forward on this. And then notice how kind God is to him, that he shows Abraham, he reiterates to Abraham and shows him the depth of the riches of the promise that he has made. Here's Abraham thinking, the promise that God has made, he's asked me to kick it into touch. How kind God is. It's at this particular juncture in history when God reveals something about himself which is as precious to you and I as believers as it was to Abraham. Just look into verse 16, where God says, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, because you have done this, I will surely bless you. Now, I'm running out of time, but you need to go home this evening and you need to read Hebrews chapter 6. You need to read the last few verses. And the writer's point is, to the Christians, I want you to understand just absolutely how certain God's promise is to you about what Jesus has done. How certain his promise is that he's going to keep you and he's going to bring you to be with him. And what does he do? He says, well, God not only gives a promise, and that's enough, God's promise, but God knows what you and I are like. he gives an oath. God's promise, God's oath. And the writer to the Hebrews sums it up by saying, by two immutable things, oath and promise, we have an anchor of the soul, even Jesus. And here it's being revealed to Abraham as he learns that trust and obedience is the way in which God calls us in all the tests of our faith to go deeper, to go richer, to go further in this wonderful experience of knowing God. Now, please notice what happens because he has taken that step of faith. And it comes out in verse 14. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. What's happening there? Well, it's this, isn't it? Abraham's faith and trust brought him to a deeper understanding of who God is. There are two things there. Abraham understood more of God's character. He's not just Jehovah, he is Jehovah Jireh. He's not just the Lord, but he is the Lord who will provide. And Abraham, throughout his journey, has learned different things about God through the names that either God has given about himself. Chapter 13 and 14, he's called the Lord. Chapter 15, God says, I'm your shield and great reward. Chapter 17, he is El Shaddai. Chapter 21, just previously, he's the Lord, the everlasting God. But now Abraham himself says, you are Jehovah Jireh. You see what's happening? Tell you what's happening. Like all good Christians, he's a theologian. Do you know that this morning? Even this evening, get it right. You're a theologian. And what I mean by that is that you and I are called by faith on this wonderful journey to get deeper and deeper and deeper into the God who has saved us in Jesus Christ. To know more and more and more of him and his ways. It's C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity who talks about the knowledge of God, the theology of God. He says Christian theology is like a 3D map by which we view and understand and learn more about the great triune God, Father, Son and Spirit that's ours. And that's exactly what's happening here with this testing. Suddenly this man sees more of this great God who is his and will provide than he's ever understood before. And notice secondly, therefore, this, that experimentally he understands more of this great lesson that the life of faith is all about. Do you remember those words we often say to one another? We walk by faith and not by sight. What does that mean? Is it like, we just go along? It doesn't mean that, does it? It means actually we are trusted in God and we're learning more of his sufficiency to provide for all our needs in the most extraordinary of life circumstances. What's the one thing that every human being forgets about life? Isn't it this? Life's a learning curve. There's always something new to learn. What's the one thing we Christians often forget? That the life of faith is a learning curve. It's meant to be a learning curve. Hey, sorry, I'm really going with this tonight. Many years ago, a good friend of mine, we took their kids, their church kids, to a theme park in the Midlands, okay? And me and my friend were looking after some of the teenagers. And my wife and his wife went off to find a ride. And we were over the other side of the park, good quarter of a mile, and suddenly there came this horrendous screams, and my friend said to me, "That's Caroline." I said, "And that's Deborah." What's the point? The point I'm trying to make is this: the Christian life, in terms of experimental, is meant to be a journey of great joy, of exhilaration, of sometimes serious questioning, but it's meant to be something that's living. And even when these trials come into our lives, and they will come, and nobody's looking for them in one sense. Abraham wasn't looking for it, was he? But God is still the same God. And please notice that the narrator, should I say, is saying to you and I, do you know what? It's true for Abraham. It's true for you too. Look at those little words in verse 14. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. But this is it. And to this day it is said. Well, who's saying it? What he's saying is, do you understand that the believers in the past who followed Abraham, just like you and I, who are further on, are learning something so wonderful here about this great God who we're called to know and live by faith and trust him. But there's a triumph in this testing that's one more step as we finished. And as someone puts it, let me cut to the chase. This relationship between Abraham and Isaac here is a beautiful picture of the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. There are three words that appear in this narrative that are used for the first time in the scriptures. In verse 1, the word to tempt, or to try, to test. In verse 5, the word worship. And in verse 2, the word love. Notice, then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love." Here's the first mention of love in the Bible. And it's a mention of the love between a father and a son. Abraham is to take the one and only son that he loves and to offer him up. And here's those wonderful, interesting little insights that the Old Testament holds to. Where's he got to take him to? A place called Moriah. In terms of its history and archaeology, Moriah became Jerusalem. This father who has to take the son whom he loves and take him up to Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. Have you, and I'm sure you've not because I'm such a poor explanation here, but have you shuddered this evening at the prospects that Abraham faced? Yeah? I hope so, because it is a very small, pale, insignificant reflection of the Father's love for the Son when he gave him up to be crucified on behalf of sinners at Calvary. Which is why, of course, our Lord Jesus taught that Abraham rejoiced to see his day. Here is Abraham, by faith, getting a reflection, an insight into that most stupendous event, that most stupendous decision on which the whole of the universe and the history of the human race is ultimately built. That the Father so loved the Son that he gave his only begotten Son to save a world that he loved. That's why Paul would later on write in Romans 8, God who did not spare his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not graciously give us all things? Are you going through testing at the moment? Are you questioning what God is doing? It's not easy, is it? But sit back and remember that this is the God who made it so clear that from eternity there was a love for his Son, and the Son's love for his Father and for the Spirit, but willingly gave him to save people like you and me. Someone's sitting there now, and I will close this. Someone's sitting there thinking, this is great, but I cannot be Abraham. No, you're not meant to be. I can't begin to live like Abraham. Well, no, I suppose we have at least got a car and other things, haven't we? But I found this week, I'd almost finished all my preparation this week, and I found this, I was reading a book by Tim Keller, and he gives an exposition, an outline exposition of this chapter. He makes 4 points. He says, here's what you must do. Like Abraham, put God first. Here's what you need to understand. You can't do it. You can't do it. Thirdly, you need to understand this. You can't do it, but there was one who did put God first. Jesus. And it was only fourthly when Jesus obeyed as Abraham did that he obeyed for us. Yeah? I can't do it. Of course you can't. But Jesus did.